Welcome to Mr. Marr's 3-Minute History, quick summaries about a range of different history topics. In today's episode we're going back to the time of the Atlantic slave trade, and we're looking at the Middle Passage. This was the journey that Africans made when they were taken from Africa to the Americas to be sold as slaves. Let's consider in the first place boarding the ships. At first, Africans had been kidnapped. Sometimes this was by Europeans and sometimes by other Africans. And before being taken to the Americas, they were held in what was known as slave forts on the African coast. Eventually, though, they were taken from these forts and they were boarded onto the ships. At this point, it was the last time most of them would ever see or feel African soil again. And at this point, the ships would make their journey. Living conditions on the ships to which the slaves were taken were incredibly poor. They were generally kept below deck in extremely cramped conditions. Most ships' captains went for a system known as tight pack, which means they squeezed in as many slaves as they could. Although this meant more of them might get ill or die, it also meant that they could sell more at the other end. There was other problems with the living conditions as well. Slaves were often kept chained, which limited their ability to move. And because they were squeezed in with limited ability to move, this quickly led to the spread of disease and poor hygiene on the ship. For example, you couldn't move to go to the toilet, and many simply had to do this where they were. The food they were given was very basic as well. It was often a very basic type of porridge oats, because these wouldn't go off during the long journey. And rather than being given cutlery with which to eat them, slaves were expected to use their hands, which was a double problem given the lack of hygiene on the ships. Another real problem that the slaves faced was physical and sexual abuse. Slaves that did not follow instructions they were given could be punished in a variety of ways, with whipping being a very common one. Other slaves were often forced to take part in physical exercise, such as dancing on the ship's deck. This was in order to keep them fit and healthy so they would sell for more once arriving in the Americas. And female slaves in particular were subject to sexual abuse, being attacked by members of the crew. One thing which particularly scared slaves, and indeed sailors who were on board the ships, was the threat of going overboard. In extreme cases, slaves who disobeyed orders or even fought back against the sailors could be thrown overboard as a punishment. This was terrifying not only because of the prospect of drowning, but in particular because of the sharks which often followed many of the slave ships. Of course, this rarely happened for the simple reason that sailors and the captains wanted to take as many slaves as possible to the Americas to sell them. Other slaves who died had their bodies thrown overboard, and in extreme cases, some slaves were so scared of what might happen that some of them committed suicide by jumping overboard and drowning themselves.